Hello and welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen, episode 70. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today we look at the key tool used by central banks around the world. But hey, the fact that they use it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Let's remember these central banks didn't see the global financial crisis coming, and they don't expect to see another one in our lifetime. That's what Janet Yellen said. So does the model stack up? That's what we're asking today. So, DSGE models. Wait for this. Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium. DSGE models. This is the lifeblood of monetary policy analysts. But what is it and how does it work? Or not work, as the case may be. So, Steve, let's start with the name, first of all. Stochastic. It means random to me. But another part of the title there is equilibrium. So can you have something which is random and also supposed to be in equilibrium? I mean, is that part of the problem here?
No, that's not the core problem. I mean, something which is random can fluctuate around an equilibrium, and because he basically Irving Fisher put this very well back when he was trying to explain why he didn't see the Great Depression coming and why it happened, and he argued that. Economic processes, he said it was generally okay to assume that economic processes, as a rule, tended towards a stable equilibrium. And he then said, but however, even if it is, then any particular variable is going to be subject to exogenous shocks of some description. I mean, the sun doesn't come up one morning, or more likely there are clouds over it, which is there are no clouds over it, which would disturb people in the UK. Too much sunshine. And therefore, that then causes a change in harvest or a change in activity, and that means you get disturbed above or below the equilibrium. And his argument was that close to an equilibrium, it's stable. Further away, it might be unstable. And so rather than forces bringing you back towards equilibrium after you go a certain distance, you might continue diverging. That's far too sophisticated for people who wrote DSGE models.
Right. But before the DSGE model, which we'll come to in a second as to what it actually means and how it works, we had the ISLM model, investment, savings, liquidity, money, which again is a model, isn't it, based on finding an equilibrium state for the economy. But that was found left wanting for whatever reason. So, I mean, before we look at DSGE, explain the ISLM model and how that worked and where that fell flat. We could be here for quite some time.
Then explain the model that came before that.
Exactly.
Actually, the cute thing about the ISLM, and that the people who've taken a look at the cartoon that I wrote recently with Miguel Guerra will see that I talk about Paul Krugman lovingly maintaining an older, slim economic equilibrator. Of course, slim is an anagram of ISLM, and the ISLM models were derided by people like Sargent, Lucas, Rapping, Kydland, and Prescott, who all gave us the initially what they're called real business cycle models, and then DSGE models. It's a cornucopia of acronyms in neoclassical economics. They derided it as being a typical Keynesian model. There's only one problem. It wasn't a Keynesian model. And the person who told us this is the person who wrote the model, which is John Hicks. And he explained that he described his model as a way of representing what he thought Keynes said in the general theory. But in fact, and I knew this in some ways before I read the article where he said that wasn't the case. I knew it because I read Hicks's papers where he attempted to build dynamic models in general. He said the ISLM model came to him roughly in 1934, years before he read Keynes, when he was trying to represent three-way trade on a two-dimensional diagram. So he had the basic idea that neoclassicals have is that microeconomics is talking about individual consumers, individual firms, maybe individual markets. Macroeconomics is what they describe as general equilibrium, covering all markets and how they interact at once. And what Hicks was doing way back in 1934 was trying to represent what happens in three markets, which you might imagine, say, being the goods market, the money market, and the labor market, three markets on a two-dimensional diagram. And he applied what is known as Volra's law. Now, Volra's law is strictly, well, it looks like an accounting concept, but it's strictly the way the neoclassicals see this accounting. And that argument goes that if you have n markets, let's say n is equal to 3, and n minus 2 of them are in equilibrium. Pardon me. n minus one of them are equilibrium. So 2 of the 3 markets are in equilibrium. Then by definition, the third has to be in equilibrium as well. Now, using that mind virus, Hicks said, okay, if I assume these 2 markets are in equilibrium, then I can ignore the third and I can draw a diagram representing what's happening between these 2 markets. And that gives me a 2-dimensional way of representing a 3-dimensional process.
Right.
Now, that sounds really cool until he realized about 50 years later, after being regularly berated by, well, we used to fight like cat and dog, but my good friend Paul Davidson, who was the editor of the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, Paul just hammered John Hicks whenever he saw him, which is quite frequently back in those days, that you can't assume certainty. You can't assume equilibrium in the sense of people's expectations being fulfilled. And in the middle of all that, Hicks realized that that's exactly what he'd done. And looking at his own model, he said, and he didn't say this as clearly as I would like him to say it, but what he fundamentally said was Volra's law, the law that if n-1 markets are in equilibrium, then the nth market also has to be in equilibrium, only applies at the point where the other markets are in equilibrium. Now, if you draw the ISLM diagram, what you got, and believe me, this is shocking. I know it's quite unusual for people. They won't be used to this in economics, but it involves 2 intersecting lines. Okay. Now,
and that point of intersection is representing what?
It represents equilibrium in both the goods market and the money market.
Right.
Now, what Hicks realized writing in 1979, he published the paper unfortunately, he published it in Paul Davidson's journal, which is called the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, and therefore precisely 0 neoclassical economists read Hicks saying that it wasn't a model of Keynes. But what he said was, if you're not at the point where the 2 curves intersect, then even if you're on one of the other 2 curves, you're at a point of disequilibrium for the second market in the diagram. And therefore, if you have 3 markets in your model, the other market must also be out of equilibrium.
Right.
And therefore, fundamentally, you have a non-equilibrium process. Therefore, the only point that makes sense on the entire diagram is the point where the 2 curves intersect.
But those two curves are, because I'm a simple person, so you've got which helps, means you've got to dumb all this down for me. So we maybe bring some other people along with it. So those 2 lines, the 2 axes are investment and savings and liquidity and money.
Yep, that's right. So you call them LL first of all. The liquidity and money is the right one. Yep.
And this is a very involved discussion, and you have just heard the first 7 minutes or so of it. Believe it or not, there's another 40 minutes or so to go. So if you want to get your head around all of it, you'll need to subscribe to hear the full interview, and you'll get access to the other 70 or so podcasts too, plus the ones that we add each week. So like the next one, for example, which is we're going to ask if the Bank of England is nuts raising interest rates. If you want to hear that, plus this one, plus all the others, you can subscribe by going to debunkingeconomics.com and picking a subscription plan, or supporting Steve on Patreon at patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, and support a level of $10 or more per month to hear all the podcasts in this series. So we hope to see you back here again soon for more. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.